Hello there, I'm your moderator, Sage Goodwin, and as always, I'm joined by the worldwide traveler, Samit Halvadia. How you doing, man?
Doing great, Sage. I'm always very excited about how you're going to introduce me. So,
I've been trying to
worldwide
switch it up.
traveler, beautiful, I'll take it. They're all complimentary.
Exactly. I try to switch it up each time. And we're also joined by Jani Anttila. Jani has been on the partner side of things, the tech side of things, and the customer side of things in the VDI space. And in today's episode, we want to go over some of the transitions in the landscape, over his career for his experience, as well as how migrations and migration management has changed through that time, as well as kind of looking ahead at how that's going to change and the automation side of things, because I think that's something that we can really get into the weeds about. Jani, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing fine. Great to be here with you guys.
So, Sage, here's an interesting fact about Yanni that a lot of people don't know. You kind of just touched on this, right? So, Yanni and I go way back, right? Yanni was one of the first app nerds that I ever met at Citrix, right? So after the actual acquisition of AppDNA being acquired by Citrix, Yanni was one of the first SEs that came over from the Citrix side and became an AppDNA subject matter expert. So since 2011, basically, Yanni's had the insight and the unfortunate pleasure of working with me in a variety of different capacities. But I'd say that qualifies him as a bona fide app nerd. And I don't throw that term around lightly. It takes a lot for an app nerd to call someone else an app nerd. So I'm really excited to chat to you, Yanni. I'm glad you're here.
That's awesome.
Great to hear that I have such a reputation in your books. I don't consider myself being in that position, but well, thank you.
And I'd say Samit is the nerdiest app nerd that I know for sure. So that comes with great recommendation there. Before we started the podcast, you're talking about how you've been in the space for a while, but not necessarily in the public side of things. And I just want to get a kind of an overview of what you've been doing in the VDI space.
Maybe I'll tell you guys how I got into the IT first place and how I got to know AppDNA and how that got me to know Rimo3. So I had quite a, let's say, different entry to IT that most people have. Most people have been studying, in their early days for IT, and they have had the service desk jobs and so on. So I got a server from a friend, and he told me that, hey, go look what you can do with it. And I was on my 30s, and I spent quite a lot of time in the basement building up different kind of basic IT stuff like email services and DNS services and all that kind of simple.
What a usual 30-year-old would do in his basement. No big deal.
Yeah, exactly. So I spent quite a lot of time there, and then my friends from IT space told me that, hey, you need to sort that thing out and start making money with it. So do something smart, not to waste your time on the basement. So I ended up completing a couple of Citrix certifications, and then my friends got me a job, and that was application packaging job, and I had no idea, but I was sold for a quite big customer here in Finland, and the task was to create Citrix app streaming packages, and I have no idea. So during on my first morning on that new job, we created the first package with my friend, and we decided that this is an easy thing to do and there is no problem. Then I went to the customer, but of course the reality was pretty much different. So there was a XenUp migration from presentation server 4.5 to XenUp 6. There was a Xen desktop implementation, and also Windows XP to Windows 7 migration. And we had like 1,500 applications, so it was a difficult place. So in the end, I kind of learned how to go through that change management process and how to work with the applications, how they are important for the customer's business. But I also needed to find a way how to make my life easier, and that's how I got to know AppDNA. And that was the moment when Citrix acquired AppDNA. So I didn't really have a chance to implement AppDNA for the customer. However, I ended up working for Citrix as an AppDNA SME. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And later on, when I was hired by our mutual colleague Ilan, he said that, Jani, someday you would be a rock star. And I was like, hey, don't worry about that kind
I mean,
of
you've
things.
got the
That's
beard
not
for it.
yeah. But eventually, I actually got a Citrix CTA from Citrix. So Ilan was kind of right. And that kind of got me into this consulting space and working with the customers, and also moving to customer side from the vendor side or from the consulting side. And that has been a kind of a big change on understanding how important the applications really are for the business. Because from consultant perspective and from technology vendor perspective, you think things a little bit different ways. But for business, it's always what the applications are doing for the business and what is the impact when the applications don't work. So the application, well, compatibility and application functionality, it's very, very important thing.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up, Jani, because, you know, right now, I consider this a huge inflection point around migrations. And, you know, a lot of my messaging to my customers and partners is very much about, and in fact, I'll do a session at Ignite today as well. It's about the journey from legacy to modern. And, you know, it's not a single migration anymore, right? It's from SCCM to Intune. It's from physical Windows 10 devices to AVD managed, you know, Windows 11 devices or cloud endpoints, or Windows 365 or Citrix Cloud managing on top of Azure, right? You brought up the fact that at this large customer, when you first started in IT, it wasn't just one migration either. And that just kind of got me to thinking that this is so cyclical. The fact that you are moving from CPS 4.5, which I love the fact that we brought up presentation server today. So that made me really happy, by the way, Jani. So CPS 4.5 to Zen app and Zen desktop, from Windows XP to Windows 7, which also meant deprecating 16-bit components and moving to 64-bit. It was multiple migrations happening at the same time. And now, like, from your perspective, working for a actual business as a customer and consumer of these technologies, are you seeing multiple migrations continue to be a thing for you right now?
Well, probably for a typical customer, no, because most of the customers has probably migrated also already away from, let's say, presentation server 4.5, or, by the way, we also have MetaFrame XP also this customer. So we're talking about really legacy stuff. But most of the business probably are in some kind of modern platform like Windows 10 or XenUp 7 dot something. But if you are on that stage, you are probably in evergreen management and your change is ongoing on a daily basis.
Sure.
But at least for us where I work at the moment, we still have lots of legacy farms. We have probably, I think, 13 Citrix legacy farms. So we are still facing those big bang migration issues. But we also need to plan on how do we avoid that thing happening in the future. So we need to prepare our applications in a way that we are able to automatically test them and analyze them and process them automatically, and maybe even converting to another format, and also improving the deployment, the ways of deployment. So every customer who is on a legacy like today, they need to consider how do they manage their applications in future, because these types of big bang migrations, they are huge tasks and they can take years. And the change should be on a daily basis. Everything is today like, you know, business says that I need something and I need it today or tomorrow latest. So you need to be able to kind of respond to those needs. And you cannot do that if you don't have this evergreen application lifecycle management stuff.
And from that perspective, Jani, so I get, you know, you're somewhat modern, but you still have a lot of legacy, right? So, you know, the day-to-day operational change management, and I've always had a curious perspective from a customer perspective. you always have something going on, like you said, in IT, right? You have your day-to-day change management and you have your strategic migrations that are happening at the same time, right? Some of it's around packaging, some of it's around a migration to a new version of Windows, some of it's moving off of physical to cloud-based, AVDs, whatever it might be. Like, from your perspective, Jani, being the subject matter expert at a customer site, how do you balance the two? Like, how do you balance what's strategic versus what's operational?
Well, that's kind of simple thing to kind of define. So when you're working at the, let's say, vendor side or on a consulting side, it's very easy to say that, hey, you should do this and then everything will be fine. But the reality is that the applications are used to run the business and produce money. So if you start considering which one is more important, getting rid of legacy and migrating to some modern platform, or keep your applications up and running and let them bang money for the business. So obviously the money wins.
Right.
So that's I think the main reason why we still have a legacy, because it's much more safe selection to let the apps run on legacy than start migrating it, because the migration, it's always creating some kind of disruptions for the business. And also there is a risk on the change. Because let's say that you would be moving from, let's say, well, in the past, from Windows XP to Windows 7, the risk was very high.
Yes.
And that risk, it still exists. We don't really care if it's migration from XP to Windows 7 or 10 to 11. It's still the same type of risk for the business. We need to make sure that the applications work. So if they're fine on the legacy, it's fine to leave them there. However, the support for the platform, what you get from the vendor, it's not good. And also there's a risk from security perspective, because old Windows version, you don't get any kind of patches for those, and it exposes you for security threats. So eventually you need to do that kind of change, but it's so kind of it involves a lot of effort and a lot of cost. So businesses are always consuming the existing stuff until the very end, or even beyond.
So do you think that's why migrations are so slow? Because they have to keep the lights on and make sure that the business is making money with their day-to-day operations. And then also it's hard and it's potentially high risk to do the migrations because nobody has enough resources. People don't have the right tooling. They might not have the subject matter expertise. The developers might have left. Like, I've always kind of wondered from a customer perspective, I get that, okay, we want to keep the lights on, and this application, I mean, there's an insurance company in Ohio, Jani, which I will not name their name, but they have a file claim backend processing system that's running on server 2000 that's being held by, held together by duct tape and band-aids. And it's like, I'm like, there's no way. What happens if something happens here? And they're like, nope, we're not touching it. Leave it alone.
As long as we don't touch it, it's going to be okay.
We're not patching it. We're not touching it. Right. Like the migration and being on the vendor side personally, and having done this for many years, I never understood why people are so slow to migrate. But your perspective is pretty interesting, where I got to focus on making money for the business as opposed to potentially doing something slightly more strategic that will save us heartburn in the future. So that's an interesting thought.
But the reality is that eventually the day will come when you need to do the big bang migration. You have to do it eventually. So when that day comes, it's of course dependent on how do you do it, who does it, do you have the resources, do you have the money to do that, and all that kind of stuff. So the problematics are kind of different, because you need to find a way how to do it. And let's say, of course, resourcing it's a difficult thing. The SMEs in application migration space or application compatibility space or large-scale migration space, you don't have that kind of people, lying all around. So it might be difficult. And like, you cannot start that kind of migration by, if you call to a vendor and ask that, what is your effort for cost and labor for this project? It's always a case. Nobody can say for sure that it will be, exactly this number. So it's an unknown thing. And that unknown thing makes it as a risky project. And if you want to start that kind of project, you need to present it to somebody, and someone who needs to kind of approve the cost and effort. So how do they approve it if it's based on the guess?
No, I mean, and these partners that are doing it, it's not that they're guessing to be malicious, Jani. Like, to your point, it's they just don't know. It's like, how long is a piece of string? You're not going to know until you unravel the entire spool, right? Like when you have the ball of yarn and you see it that it's 75 feet. Every organization is different, and so when you think about like making that business case back to the business, Jani, like I know you're going through a migration right now, and you guys are doing some really kind of bleeding edge modernization work in your current engagement. Like how were you able to convince the business that it was time to move forward with something a bit more strategic while keeping the lights on?
Well, I would say that we didn't have a choice anymore, because we were not able to serve the business in a way that they expected us to do. So we absolutely must do this in order that we can serve the business and improve the IT capabilities on producing the money.
Yeah.
So coming back to the point, that the guessing point, do you, Samit, know which was my favorite feature in AppDNA?
I would guess it's the effort calculator.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and it was, and the best part is it was completely free.
Yeah, it was 1,000% free, and it was fairly accurate. In fact, we tried to, if you remember back in the day at Citrix, they had a thing called Project Accelerator. Do you remember that website?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So in theory, it's brilliant, right? So Sage, when you do a VDI implementation, it's a hard thing to do. What's going to be server virtualization? What's app virtualization? What's desktop virtualization? Who needs offline access? Which applications will work in which environment? How to best deliver an application to an end user based on their user segment, whether they're knowledge worker, task worker. This concept that Jani's talking about, like our effort calculator was just around testing and automating the testing and conversion of applications so that you can move them into a modern format. But part of the reason, and I do a lot of these calls now, these consulting calls with investment firms that ask about Citrix and Tibco. And, part of the reason that VDI never reached its full market penetration capability, you talk to Gartner, you talk to some of these industry analysts, they say we got about 10% market penetration with VDI, and that's it. Mainly because of the fact that the upfront planning, to Jani's point, there's too many unknowns, right? How do I do user segmentation? Which ones are my knowledge workers? Who needs offline access? Is it worth having a persistent desktop? Can this person be part of a pooled multi-session? Is this, all these questions are really difficult questions to answer when you start planning and rolling out VDI, right? And people are going through this same type of process right now, even though Jani's kind of blurred in the northern lights right now, when they're starting to think about like, okay, which of my applications do I move to MSIX? Which ones are good candidates for app volumes and containerization? Which desktops and endpoints should be managed through Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365? These are all still unknowns. And it's really funny that people are still making a living trying to build projects around this. So Project Accelerator was a thing that Citrix had tried to put together. And I thought it was a great tool where it would help you build some of that out. But I'm glad you brought up the effort calculator, Jani. That was one of our favorite features.
Yeah. And by the way, the way how the migration world has changed from those times, the problem really was always that where do we migrate our application? What is the compatibility of the application on the target platform? And that defined where to migrate it. But
that's true.
Today, I think that the thing is a little bit different, because we have, a lot of places where to deploy the application, but everything is actually running on Windows 10. So if you think about Citrix in Azure, it's running on multi-user Windows 10. If it's on workstation, it's Windows 10. If it's something else, it's always Windows 10. If it's in public cloud, in on-prem, it might be a server operating system. But anyway, you get the point. It's not about where to deploy the apps, but let's say in Rimo3 case, you are marketing that you are helping customers moving away from SCCM to Intune. So it's not about where to go, but it's how to get away from the existing environment, for example, the SCCM, because the SCCM kind of it's a problematic stuff, because nobody really wants to have SCCM anymore. They want to be in iTunes.
Intune. Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so how do you get your apps away from SCCM? And why do you want to get away from SCCM? It's that the SCCM infrastructure, it costs money, and companies are probably already paying for Intune. So why do they have the SCCM? But it's damn difficult to get rid of SCCM.
And I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because as near and dear to my heart as Citrix is, it's seen the same way in certain instances as SCCM, right? It's seen as something that can be a bit legacy. Although, with the innovation and stuff like that, the fact that you can manage hybrid workflows and hybrid workspaces through Citrix Cloud is fantastic. So on the one hand, SCCM is an interesting one, Jani, because when SMS first came out, this might be before you were in IT, right? I remember before SMS was bought by Microsoft, it was like the greatest thing, because before that, electronic software delivery, that's what it was called, ESD, was done via sneakernet, meaning someone would run around from computer to computer and install it via CD-ROM on your machine, right? So SMS at the time, which became Config Manager in 1998, 1999, was a groundbreaking technology. And the problem is, every enterprise is reliant on it for endpoint management for any on-prem workload, because they have 22 years worth of technology and debt and customizations and conditional logic and dependency mapping. All that stuff is in there. You can't just pick it up and pull it into Intune, right? So like when I look at people trying to do the same thing with Citrix and move to potentially AVD or, it's not so much about it's running on Windows 10, Jani. It's more about, how do I get this workload, A, out of my existing workflow, B, into a more modern format, and C, deployed to the area that I want to ultimately manage it in, right? And those are the things that we're kind of starting to see as a multi-threaded migration process, whereas historically, XP to Windows 7 was a single thread, right?
It's kind of going back to that idea that you said, Jani, of like, it's Windows 10 underneath everywhere, but we have many different flavors. Like you want coffee, okay, but what kind of coffee do you want? Do you want
exactly?
Do you want a latte? Do you want a macchiato? Do you want it a cappuccino? Like it's basically the same thing, but like the way it changes is very different, right?
Yeah, and actually, when you're doing migration from, let's say, from SCCM to Intune, even though you would be from business perspective, even though you would be able to teleport to applications overnight, well, that's of course great. But then you need to start thinking about, how do you deploy those applications to your users' workstations? So if you have on-prem SCCM and your users are at office, they are doing it on the local network. But once you teleport the applications to Intune, you need to do it over the WAN connection. And you need to consider what is your WAN connection capability on deploying the apps on users' workstations. They are consuming a lot of that. So your networks needs to support it. So that kind of takes us to another consideration. How do you tackle that? Well, users are today mostly working from home, and they're using their own home internet connection. But of course, business cannot rely on that. They can, come back to office, and the office network needs to support it. So how do you do it? You put the applications on AVD or Citrix or some other virtualization platform, because the need for bandwidth consumption is much less. You just deploy the apps there, and users are just, consuming it. So do you really need to deploy the applications on the workstations?
Well, I mean, and that's the thing about Intune, right? With MDM capabilities, with the ability to manage pure DAS like Windows 365 and AVD through Intune and the physical endpoints, that's the game changer between Intune and Config Manager. I mean, but to your point, like you talked about network and bandwidth, one of the things that I'm seeing, and I'm curious to get your perspective, Jani, is it's not so much, I mean, the apps are a big problem, right? So we know that. That's why we built Rimo3. But the other side of it is, how do people reconcile the differences between a local AD domain join and Azure AD? I've heard that process is quite painful for people to start getting their users off of the local AD into Azure AD. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, of course, it's kind of a problem because on-prem AD, you have the group policies and you have designed your whole system for 20 years by the on-prem AD, and you probably need to do something. You have on-prem apps and you need to have the on-prem AD, and you need to have the on-prem AD credentials, because there might be some applications where you cannot use Azure AD credentials to log in and authentication and so on and so on. So the hybrid model comes there. But of course, it would be nice to once again teleport from on-prem AD to Azure AD, but it's not just possible. And the hybrid join model is something there in between, so that you can manage the legacy group policies and that kind of stuff. But at least for us, there is a strong will to move towards cloud-first type of users. When they are only living in the cloud, they have only the Azure AD credentials, their machines are only in Azure AD. However, how do you do that? So my thought here is that probably there is different types of users within the businesses. So if you have a, let's say, business who is producing something, they have factories, and of course they have the sales organization also, and the administration and the finances and so on. So the blue collar people probably need the on-prem stuff, because the production applications on the production line, all the sensors and all that stuff is so legacy and so expensive, and probably the developer is dead and so on. So that's not going anywhere anytime soon. But the white collar people, they could be cloud-only users, like very easily, I would say. So teleport them to Azure AD and all that kind of modern stuff, and then leave the blue-collar people on-prem. Because there is always this thing that there is the factory, and the Putin might explode internet. So their applications need to work without the internet connection. So they need to be on-prem anyways.
Yeah, so I mean, you're talking about the next generation of user segmentation. We talked about this before: who's a knowledge worker, who's a task worker, who's an information worker. So that makes complete sense. I think the interesting thing for us too, and from your perspective, I look at us, I look at Rimo3, right? We're a relatively new company, we're a startup, growing, but everything we do, because we don't have legacy technical debt or homegrown applications, everything's done through Azure AD. We are a cloud first company, right? We have very few locally installed applications. We have no legacy SCCM. Everything's managed through Intune. I do everything through Windows 365. But you look at enterprises, even your customer you're talking about now, white collar versus blue collar, right? It's really hard to do that user segmentation and get rid of some of that legacy debt, even for the users that are potentially not using heavy machinery based on-prem necessary applications. And that's one of the things that I kind of see as being a reason that while DAS and AVD has opened up the floodgates, and I always say it's brought VDI to the masses, right? Like even a car dealership now has the ability to administrate their own IT and take advantage of virtualization and desktop as a service. That was not possible with the days of Citrix. That was not possible with just the days of VMware, because it was cost prohibitive. So I see the problems that you're talking about, Jani, becoming even more exacerbated as more and more market segments start adopting virtualization in the form of DaaS. So I'm really excited that on the one hand, more and more companies are adopting virtualization or DaaS, but on the other hand, they're about to run into a lot of the problems that we've seen historically, where I think the subject matter experts like yourself, just they're not a dime a dozen. They're not everywhere to be found. So, I'm very interested from a Rimo perspective to build tooling that will allow and address some of these types of concerns as more and more users adopt DaaS, right? And you talk about evergreen management, and that's really kind of where we see ourselves going.
And also, if you think about the DaaS world and the AVD, well, AVD, that's Azure only. So there is always the question that why not? Everybody has internet and so on. So it would be easy to say that you can trust the internet and you can have high availability for your internet connections, and you can have high availability in the cloud within the Azure, or you can probably expand somehow your solutions over multiple public clouds.
Right.
So you could say that it's resilient and it's reliable. But then when you start thinking that, well, if your Azure is, or your network actually is going down for, let's say, 8 hours, somebody takes an excavator and cuts the cables when you're doing some kind of land yard work on your factory site. So it will cut the internet. And when you are starting to think about the risks, and you think about how much downtime costs on your applications. For example, I know that there is applications where downtime can cost hundreds of euros per minute, and that's only one application. So quite quickly you start getting the justification for the on-prem environment if your losses are in millions per day. So
on that topic, what do you guys think is the percentage of the cloud usage that we're going to get to? Do you see us getting up to, obviously maybe not 100%, but what does that look like for both of your experiences and Jani with your variety of different experiences in the background, Samit with your different experiences as well? Where do you see that going?
Well, like I said, it depends on the type of the business, but I would be very happy if I get let's say 50% of my server capacity transferred to Azure. That would be a big win. However, if the business is different, let's say that you don't have any kind of production facilities, then the rate is, of course, much more closer to 100%.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jani, because I see it being slightly lower than that, right? And the reason for it is not because people don't want to do it, but because they want to keep the lights on, to your point, right? They want to stay on legacy as long as that they can. In my lifetime, I'd be thrilled. And Jani's right. It's 100% dependent on market segment, right? Like if you look at even inside of the same business. So if you look at like financial services and insurance, for instance, certain customer facing components are going to go cloud first immediately. They might even be redeveloped as SaaS from the ground up because it's a revenue generating asset, or a market trading platform with an algorithm that is a competitive differentiator. They might move that for better performance in a cloud type of environment. But there are certain components that are always going to remain on-prem. And the reality is, the way that I see kind of DaaS in the next 10 years is I see closer to 20 to 25% of workloads moving to that space. And I think that the market penetration for DaaS, by the way, is going to be way higher than the 10% that VDI had in the enterprise. Because like I look at what we've already seen Azure Virtual Desktop do, 10 million endpoints under management in 1 year. There's 1.4 billion endpoints under management overall. There is a rate of penetration and adoption that's happening that far supersedes what we saw, Jani, during the Citrix days or during the VDI days. I'm hopeful and bullish that in the next 10 years, you get 20 to 25% of workloads sitting up in a DaaS offering. Again, to Jani's point, depending on the market segment or the vertical that your business is in.
Yeah. And kind of the 50%, which I mentioned, that's kind of my wet dream. It has nothing, it's not based on reality. That would be just my thought on what would be the big win of implementing public cloud.
Huge. And if we get, I mean, and because then you have to remember there's that whole government FedRAMP, you know, you've got MOD, DOD, and all of these other organizations that we don't even really know about that exist, that manage satellites and stuff like that, that have an entirely different kind of, you know, use case and market segment that may never be moving to the cloud.
So looking forward a bit, where do you see, both of you, question for both of you, where do you see automation taking a big part into this? Because I think that's going to be a key player in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's already, we're seeing some incredible advancements already just this year. Where does automation take place?
So for me, it's very clear. So if you consider that the business has moved into a state that they are on evergreen application and device management, the change is ongoing. So let's take a business who has, let's say, 500 apps, and they want to stay on the Microsoft patch release cycle. They have only 2 options, because they need to test the changes, or that would be the smart way to do it. So obviously they don't have the resources to do that, the testing manually. So they have only 2 options: either they automate it or they don't test it, and they take the risk that things break. And everybody knows, if it works, don't touch it. So then it goes to the next point. If they want to secure the operations, they don't touch it, which means they don't patch it. So eventually they have only one option: they need to automate it, or then they take the risk of failures. And like I said, if it works, don't touch it. And if you want to avoid the incidents because of your changes, you have no other way than automate the testing. That's the only way how you can manage the or make sure that your services are up and running for the business, no matter the change.
You know, you're 100% right, Jani. Spray and pray, as I like to call it, is not a strategy. You know, just pushing it out and hoping that nothing breaks. Although, because of the lack of resources and constraint that is out there in the workforce today, Sage, that is oftentimes people have built in a 10% downtime, you know, just because they're like, hopefully we don't hit that. But if we do, we'll allocate 10% of our resources to fixing the issues once they're broken, but hopefully nothing breaks. And, you know, you've heard the term hope is not a strategy. I think, I think automation in general is becoming more and more prevalent in all operational IT aspects, not just application testing, even getting a patch, even assembling a workspace, even testing applications, even building images, even staging and host pools, even, you know, migration to Azure AD. All these different components that required a level of subject matter expertise have kind of become simpler to do. But that's a great thing that it's simpler, but there's more to do, and you have the same number of resources that you always had. So I like to think of this as, you know, I did a VM blog on this at the beginning of the year. One of my predictions for 2022 and 2023 is that legacy IT operations automation is going to become a big part of that overall space, right? Whether it's automated testing, automated evergreen, automated patch management, automated workspace delivery, it doesn't matter. You cannot keep up with the pace of change with the resources that we had 20 years ago, because the rate of change is gone. I mean, at AVD, Azure makes 1,200 changes a year. AWS, Amazon Workspaces, makes 2,000 changes a year. On top of that, you have your workspace changing. There's no way that you can keep up with that change without some level of automation. Yeah. So I say automate the mundane, which is basically legacy IT operations. It plays a big role in my view there.
Yeah, you could also say that if you're not investing in automation, or especially in automating the testing activities, so then you could kind of ask yourself a question that, are you accepting loss of revenue because of not implementing automation, or are you accepting the cost, the loss of revenue because of the changes? And no business should do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of the times the kicker on migrations is, oh, we need to do this. Do you think what are some I want to touch on that a little bit deeper on why that is, and two, what are some of the other kickers that you are seeing in your day-to-day on why people are migrating?
Well, there is obviously multiple reasons. Well, security, you don't get security patches for legacy stuff. You need to, serve the business better, but you also need to deliver better ways of working for your end users. If we think about legacy Citrix, for example, it's completely different thing than it's today. So today it enables a lot of stuff, and previously it was just a way for publishing an app. Now it's complete remote access strategy and all that kind of stuff. So it's completely different thing. And because of the COVID-19, people moved out from offices to their homes. So you need to provide world-class remote access capabilities for your users. And that's one of the drivers where I think which makes people or businesses actually to implement this kind of modern solutions like AVD or Citrix or whatever remote stuff.
Yeah, remote access is a big part of it. I mean, Sage, look at the way that you work, right? I mean, this is your first big job out of, in your IT career, I should say, in your end user compute career. And the way that you work is very different than the way that when I started, right? We were just getting, if you remember the Sony Trio, that was like my first phone where it was like a it was a PDA. Like
I forgot about that phone.
The Trios, right? Like, and then came the BlackBerry with the enterprise server, where it was all about security. But to Jani's point, until things go end of support, people have a hard time unless it stops, unless it mitigates risk, generates revenue, or saves cost. Those are the three things that will cause people to take action. Without one of those three things, there's no reason to take action. If you're already doing what you're doing and it's working, people aren't going to change. So risk mitigation and cost savings and a great work experience were part of the reasons that you saw AVD explode at the time that it did, when people, the remote workforce went to basically 100% for the first time in global history. That's not a thing. Now we're still hovering around 60% with people going in 2 days a week or maybe 3 days a week. So I think that the three, the three factors that will inspire change or migration is either, is it going to generate revenue? Is it going to save cost? Or is it going to mitigate risk? If it's not doing those, there's no kicker, no reason to move.
Yeah. You shouldn't do the migrations just because for the fun of migrations.
That's right.
Have the business justification there also.
Yeah.
Even though migrations are good for you.
They are fun. They are fun. They are fun, Jani. Come on.
But they're also painful.
They're very painful. Without automation, they're very painful.
Yeah. But anyway, we guys love challenges, so we love migrations.
To close this conversation out, where do you guys see the future of these migrations going forward? We touched a lot about on the history, kind of what's happening now, but where do you see it going in the next 5 to 10 years on the migration pathway, and especially from your variety of experiences?
Well, very difficult question. Honestly, I don't have an answer for that, but I would like to see more automation, and maybe this is one of the wet daydreams, some kind of artificial intelligence. So you wouldn't need to manage the migration anymore, but there would be some kind of intelligence on deciding for you how to do it, where to put the applications, and it would actually do it.
Yeah, that is a very ambitious nirvana that you've painted there, Jani. But I think just really simply put, we're starting to see a convergence, and I think that convergence is going to happen even more closely. Desktop engineering and endpoint management used to be a very different group, and Jani can attest to this. It used to be a different group that ran Config Manager than that ran Citrix, or that ran VMware, or that ran virtualization or VDI. with Intune, with AVD, with the hybrid work styles of physical, mobile devices, cloud-based devices, virtual devices, there's a great convergence coming. And Intune is one of these management planes that shows you that physical, mobile, virtual, and cloud-based are things that people are going to want to support. So the good news is that, the technology is evolving in a way that the users and the workforce will want to consume it. But the challenge is that now you need someone in tooling that's so smart that you're going to be able to take advantage and manage all those different types of workspaces. So it should be a really interesting 5 to 10 years as you start seeing, things shift from physical to cloud-based, or from, Citrix to AVD, or any of those things, or even file formats changing to become more portable. So I think that what you're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years is a great convergence of what has historically been 2 or 3 different groups becoming one.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I also think that before you can have any kind of artificial intelligence for migrations, you need to do something first. And I think that's integrations for different types of systems, like, let's say, ServiceNow, Intune, different types of Microsoft platforms, what there are, Citrix, and you need to also collect the information, not only the technical information from those deployment and presentation systems, but also from your business, like ServiceNow. So you would gain more understanding about the applications and application portfolio, how they are used, who is owning them, and what is the best way of deploying them, and what is the impact for business, and all that kind of stuff. But that also has a problem, because it's very dependent on the data on the ITSM management systems. Yeah. So you cannot kind of rely on that unless the business has the data. So is the business is going to build that data because of migrations? Probably not.
Yeah. Well, and that's the challenge, Jani. Like, have you tried to get a subject matter expert to sit down and test an application in the seat? Like getting a trader to come in and test the application on Windows 7 in a new or Windows 11 in a new version of Chrome. Just to get 30 minutes of their time is like a 7-week scheduling task, right? Nobody wants to do that. They have their regular day job as they should, right? But this was great. So Jani, it's always a pleasure when our paths cross. So I'm glad we had the opportunity to nerd out a little bit. And it was one of my favorite things is kind of getting that customer perspective of it's fine. I learned a lot about why things stay the way that they do for so long. So appreciate your insights and some of your expertise today. And thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks. It was also fun for me. It was very, very fun to catch up with you after all these years. And I'm pretty sure that we will meet again.
Rimo3 offers automated pre-deployment testing of Windows applications, OS updates, and security patches. Use unattended automation to test and assess application readiness for Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows 365, Azure Virtual Desktop, as well as identifying MSIX and multi-session suitability. Your apps, your workspace, our priority.